Our distinguished guest tonight is Shibley Telhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, College Park, and Fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. He is the author of numerous books, including The Stakes, America and the Middle East, which was selected by the publication Foreign Affairs as one of the most influential books on the Middle East. Professor Telhami is fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. He has advised the U.S. mission to the United Nations, the U.S. Department of State, Congressman Lee Hamilton, and George Mitchell. He has co-drafted reports on Israel and Palestine at the request of governmental bodies, as well as think tanks such as the Council on Foreign Relations. And he regularly contributes op-eds and appears on national and international radio and television. This evening, Professor Telhami will discuss his new book, The World Through Arab Eyes. In his view, the key to understanding the region lies in looking closely at the strongly held values and beliefs of its people and how they define themselves. This is a journey into understanding Arab hearts and minds, and we're privileged to have as our guide one of the great interpreters of the Arab world. Please join me in welcoming Shibley Telhami.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure for me to be back here. This is when I come back to the San Francisco Bay Area, I feel like it's a home for me. I've spent many years here going to Berkeley and getting my PhD at Berkeley. I met my wife here. We got married here. I have siblings here, and I'm still a 49ers fan. So it really is a pleasure. And I go a long way in my back in my relationship with the World Affairs Council as well. In fact, dating back to the days when I was a graduate student here at Berkeley 30 years ago. And I was reminded of that just a few weeks ago. I ran into an old friend, one of America's great diplomats, Harold Saunders, who had been associated with this institution here as well. And he reminded me that the first time we met, I actually interviewed him, my very first major interview for my very first book at the annual conference of the World Affairs Council of Northern California. And so I have a lot of affection for this place, and it's really a pleasure to be back. Let me tell you first a little bit about this book and the project behind it, and then I'm going to limit my remarks, obviously, to a focused three major points I want to make about the Arab world. This book, I started thinking about it really 20 years ago, especially after the 1991 war, the first Iraq war, and in part because I think as a student of international politics in the region who had spent time studying that war and partly in government during that period of time, I could see that Arab public opinion, which had been dismissed categorically because the Middle East was made up of dictatorships across the board, it was dismissed because it was thought that there was no publics don't matter when you have authoritarian rulers. And yet, everything I observed told me otherwise, that even when you have authoritarian rulers, public opinion mattered, but not necessarily in the direct way that people think of it. So I started thinking about it early then, and I wrote some articles related to it in the early 1990s. But when the information revolution exploded with the advent of the satellite television, particularly Al Jazeera in the mid-1990s, it was clear to me that we're witnessing something transformative, that the information revolution was bound to have an impact on not only how people see the world in the Arab world and the role in it, and how the public might become more empowered and more independent in its thinking from the governments, but also it might even have impact on the way people define themselves, on identities across time. And so I set out to study this relationship between the information revolution, the changing media environment, and how Arabs define themselves and how that impacts the way they see the world. And so I designed a 10-year series of public opinion polls in 6 countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, and Lebanon. And these polls were done before the Arab uprising started and continued after the Arab uprising started. So we had a certain contrast. And the idea was that what we really need to understand is how opinion and notions of identity are changing over time as you have this expanding information revolution. So the book really is an interpretation of the changing environment in the Arab world using this information that we have acquired through polling over time. And just to give you a flavor of the themes of the book, because I'm not going to cover all of them, of course, I invite any questions related to those themes, but just to give you a flavor, it starts by talking about changing notions of identities in the Arab world and how this has been impacted by the information revolution. There are chapters on the media environment and how it's changing with the advent of satellite television, social media, and the internet, and a chapter specifically on Al Jazeera, trying to understand what makes it tick and does it really shape opinion in the Arab world. What have we found out in the process? There is studies of attitudes towards specific issues, like the Arab-Israeli issue, which I call the prism of pain through which Arabs see the world. The Iraq War, how Arabs see Iran. A lot of people think that it's a very simple relationship vis-a-vis Iran. The complexity of this relationship, particularly given the sectarian Sunni-Shia issue that some people think is very important, and yet you find a far more complex relationship related to that. Certainly attitudes toward the U.S., how they have evolved over time. What makes the attitudes tick toward the United States? Is it really specific things that the U.S. does, or some bigger issues that frame Arab analysis of American intentions? How has it changed over time? Is it changing? What would it take to influence that public opinion positively? Attitudes toward other global powers, including rising powers like China and Europe, and certainly attitudes towards social and political issues domestically, how Arabs feel about democracy, about the role of religion in politics, about women, and the role of women, how that is evolving. And there's also an analysis of how American public opinion is changing in the attitudes toward the Arab world, because we've done some polling here in the U.S. to analyze that. So there's a whole set of issues that are addressed in the book, and obviously I'm not going to cover all of them today. But I invite questions related to them, and I also invite questions related to hot issues of the day about which I think and write, and including recent articles I wrote on the Syria crisis, on the Egypt crisis, and on the Arab-Israeli issue that I continue to write about. So I welcome questions about broader themes and the themes that I'm going to address. But allow me to make 3 basic points and the related points about how the Middle East is changing and what we have found, particularly with reference to public and the importance of public in the region. The first focus is changing notions of identity in the Arab world, how Arab identify themselves, and how that is changing in ways that are meaningful, because I happen to think that identity is the first place to start when you want to analyze opinion, because identity comes before opinion. Identity drives opinion sometimes, and sometimes in order to understand the meaning of opinion and the origins of opinion, you have to understand identity. And the second issue is the role of foreign policy in the events that are unfolding. I know a lot of people believed, particularly with the rise of the Arab uprising, that foreign policy had nothing to do with it. I want to show you that it does have something to do with it. I want to talk about that a little bit and the consequences of foreign policy issues. And the third point I want to make is trying to define what is unique about these set of Arab uprisings that have swept the region from Tunisia to Egypt to Yemen to Syria to Bahrain. What is unique about them in historical perspective? What is driving them, and where are they headed? And I want to make some few remarks related to that. Let me start with the first remark related to identity. One of the questions that we ask in the polls is acknowledging that people are complex, we all are, that you can be simultaneously an Egyptian and an Arab and a Muslim and a Christian or a citizen of the world. You can be all of the above. But we do understand that at different times, people put emphasis on one identity over the others. And so we wanted to find out, number one, which identity are people emphasizing more? And second, what explains it? And third, what are the implications? What does it mean? And so what we found, so we asked people, assuming that you're all these things, which identity is more important to you today? An Arab, a Muslim, your relationship with the state, a citizen of Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia, a citizen of the world, which one is more important to you? What we found over the decade is that there was a decline in people's affinity with the state. So people identified with their own states less than in the past over time. And their identity with, identification with Islam and with Arabs increased over the decade, particularly with Islam. There was the particularly sharp rise in Islamic identity over the decade, a sharp decline in identification with the state. It varied from country to country, to be sure. They weren't all the same. For example, in Saudi Arabia, we had the weakest identification with the state. Just about 20% said they're Saudis first. In Lebanon, we had the highest identification with the state. And in Egypt, we had kind of the most balanced identification of Egyptian, Arab, and Muslim, even though there was also a rise over time in Islamic identity. What I want to say, first of all, I want to provide an explanation and an interpretation of what it means. I think one of the things that we have made as mistakes that have been made among analysts is to assume that this decline in state identification and the rise in Islamic identity was an embrace of Islamist political movements. And when we witnessed then the elections in Egypt, particularly the parliamentary elections, the sweeping victory of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi party, people assumed that's where, that's the course of history in the Arab world. We witnessed what happened in Libya. Again, in Tunisia, Islamist parties, the opposition in Jordan was largely Islamist. That there was an interpretation that this Islamic identification was simultaneously an embrace of political Islam that is on the rise and sweeping the region. That's where the weight of history is. I think that was a mistake. And let me give you a different interpretation of what actually transpired through that. Number one, part of the intensification of what I call transnational identity, meaning people identifying themselves with other people outside their own boundaries. That's what Arab identity means. That's what Islamic identity means. Part of that is a function of the rise of the transnational media. For example, if you looked at 20 years ago when I asked people, what is your main source of news, they would say their government television. Now when you ask people, what is your main source of news, they will identify a television station from outside their own boundaries. And when you have television media that is catering to the broader Arab and Muslim community, you're in a way focused on the issues that appeal to those communities broadly, and you reinforce those identities that are transnational. That's one reason. But it's bigger than that. I think I propose a different approach to the selection of identity, why people select one aspect of identity over the other. And I say it is really driven by two tendencies at two extremes. On the one extreme, people embrace the identity that they have to defend most. And on the other extreme, people embrace the identity that provides the most efficient vehicle to their aspirations. So you have a selection on the one hand. When I say you are who you have to defend, we all know it. You know, if you're an American and critical of the Obama administration, you go to Europe and everybody is criticized America, you're the first one to defend America. I find that to be true of most people. If you're a woman and not focused on women's issue and you go and you hear somebody criticizing women, you are first and foremost a woman. You emphasize that aspect that you have to defend. Why is, I heard this from one time, I can't recall, one very perceptive analyst referring to African Americans. Why do we think of African people who have a white parent and an African American parent to be African Americans? Why is Obama an African American man, not a white man? Why is that the case? Because you are what you have to defend. And so there is, on the one hand, if you look at Muslims over the past decade, they have had to deal with defending Islam against this civilizational clash thesis and the assumption, particularly after 9/11. And we see that in the polls. Overwhelming majorities think that one aim of American foreign policy, Western policy, was to weaken Islam, to weaken Muslims. So there was a sense of assault that they were also defending against, meaning when they say I'm Muslim, people mean many things. It could be a political identity, it could be a cultural identity, and it depends on the context. They could say they're Muslim first to a foreigner, but they don't say the same thing to a fellow Muslim. The point is that when they assert that, they are saying, we don't have to apologize for the fact that we're Muslim. We don't have to apologize for the fact that Sharia is part of my religion, even if they're not particularly religious or not particularly intent on the application of Sharia to law. That, coupled with what I say, the decline of the state identity, in large part because of the failure of the state. When you look at every single Arab state, whether that witnessed the revolts, you had a failure of the state to provide the goods to their people. And coupled with that, it is very hard to tell the difference between ruler and the state. If you were a Libyan and had, like the overwhelming majority of Libyans had been born obviously after 1969, they knew no one throughout their lives but Gaddafi as the ruler. He had been in power since 1969. Mubarak had been in power for 30 years. So it's very difficult for people to differentiate state from ruler. And when you're angry with your ruler, you're very uncomfortable identifying with the state because state and ruler are more or less the same. So you have the decline in the state, you have the rise in Islamic identity, and Arab identity, by the way, remained robust throughout. It didn't decline in some places. It rose, but not as much as Islamic identity. So what I'm suggesting to you is that this is not necessarily an embrace of political Islam, and we found it in other polls. Let me give you two examples before I move on to the next point. One example is in Egypt itself. When we ask people, by the way, in global polls, you know, whether they're by Pew or Gallup or other outfits, when you ask people how religious they are, Egyptians tend to be very religious. Over 90% of Egyptians say they're religious or religion is important in their daily lives. When I polled in Egypt in May of 2012 and asked people, do they want Sharia law to be a basis of the Constitution, as Egypt was debating this relationship between Sharia law and the Constitution, I had 2/3 of Egyptians say yes. That's quite substantial when you also take into account that 10% of Egyptians are actually Christian. So it's a pretty substantial percentage of Egyptians who say yes. But then when you follow up with a question and say, do you believe that Sharia law should be implemented literally or should be adapted to modern times? The overwhelming majority said adapted to modern times. Over 80% of those who said Sharia law should be a basis. They have a different interpretation of it. Another example. When we were focused on Al-Qaeda in the 1990s, we did a poll among the sample that we had on what aspect of Al-Qaeda people found attractive, if at all. And many, of course, didn't find anything attractive about Al-Qaeda. But the number one answer was the fact that it stands up to the United States. It was sort of the enemy of my enemy. And fewer than 10%, in some cases fewer than 8%, said they embrace their agenda of puritanical Islam. Very clear. A third example, in the Egyptian election where the Muslim Brotherhood candidate won in the elections, people forget that even the first round of presidential elections, the Muslim Brotherhood's candidate won only 1/4 of what was 1/2 of the population voting. But it happened to be the largest percentage. In fact, the two top candidates in that election together got less than 50% of the Egyptian vote. And so, so the fact is that they won did not mean a real embrace. And I think in some ways, this issue pertaining to the Brotherhood in Egypt was, I think, fascinating, because I think the Muslim Brotherhood in particular overestimated the extent to which there was a real embrace of their agenda. Because when you look at them, you can say Egyptians, when they expressed anger with the Brotherhood, there were many reasons for it. The economy was failing, they didn't govern very well. Of course, they had opposition who were waiting for them to make a mistake to jump on them, opportunism, all of that is true of course. But I think people would have had patience even with the economy, would have had patience if they didn't believe that the Brotherhood was trying to remake Egypt in its own shape, to dominate, which is something that no one wanted, including some people who had voted for them, didn't envision that. And I can relate to you one little story. Prior to the overthrow of Morsi, I happened to visit in Egypt. And I went to President Morsi's palace to meet with one of his top foreign policy advisor, and had a conversation over the direction the country is going, and also explaining to them the sort of reservations that Americans had on particularly the constitutional issue, where there was a sense that they were not encompassing in their approach. And he said to me, what do you make of the fact that we had a constitution and we got over 60% of the people vote for it? I mean, what do you mean we're not representative enough? You have 64% people voted for this resolution. I said, yes, but look at the low turnout, first of all. That's an indication of when you have a constitution, you have such low turnout, a very small percent of the population voting. But then I said, Cairo voted against the Constitution. And he said, Cairo is not Egypt. And he was right, Cairo is not Egypt. But I said, Cairo is not Egypt, but it's the heart of Egypt. You can win an election without Cairo, but you can't govern without Cairo. And so there was a sense that they really fully misunderstood the context in which they're operating. And not to justify what happened before, that's a whole issue separately, but there's no question in my own mind that there was a misinterpretation of this decline of the state identity, increase in Islamic identity, misinterpretation that this is an embrace of political Islam. It is not, it hasn't been. It's a failure of analysis, I think, to focus on it. Second point I want to make very quickly. there is a notion that emerged after the Tunisian Egyptian revolutions particularly, that foreign policy wasn't an issue at all in the Arab uprisings, in part because it really wasn't much observed in the demonstrations, and people talked about dignity and freedom and democracy, and they talked about the economy. Sometimes they talked about foreign policy, but it wasn't a central part of the theme. And I suggest that that is a misinterpretation of what happened. Of course, in the first place, this was a revolt for freedom from authoritarian rulers. Of course it was, because the rulers failed both to provide these freedoms, to provide dignity to the citizens, and to provide economically, and provide jobs, and to provide better education, all of that. But that had been going for decades. That alone can't explain why these revolts happened when they did. And when you hear Arabs talk about dignity, it is impossible to separate the dignity that comes, or the indignity that comes in the relationship with the rulers, from the indignity that they perceive in the relations with the outside world. And they evaluate the rulers in failing to represent who they are and failing to provide them with that dignity, not only on domestic issues, but also on foreign policy issues. And I'll give you 3 examples to end with. One example is the question of identity that I mentioned. Think about it for a minute, first of all. When most Arabs say they're first either Muslim or Arab, not Egyptian or Jordanian or Saudi, think about this. They may mean whatever they mean by saying it, religion, politics, but what it does mean is that they first and foremost identify with people outside their own states. They identify with people, with other Arabs who are not countrymen, with other Muslims who are not countrymen. They create a bond instantly with people outside their own boundaries. It puts foreign policy at center stage. But the second is a follow-up question that we ask, which is, do you believe that your government, your own government, which is supposed to serve the interests of the citizens, should serve the interest of its citizens, the interests of Arabs, the interests of Muslims, more broadly, beyond the citizens? We get 50% or more saying the interests of Arabs and Muslims outside, not the citizens. That puts foreign policy at center stage right there. Second, if you look at the whole decade preceding the Arab uprisings, what really mobilized public opinion? What were the people angry about? What did we see on Al Jazeera, all these satellite televisions that were brought into prominence that we saw here in America and elsewhere around the world? What got people to the streets? What got people to express anger during that whole debate leading up to the 2010 uprising that started in Tunisia and Egypt? 2000, the collapse of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, then the first intifada, the second intifada, the Al-Aqsa intifada, with the bloodshed between Israel and the Palestinians. That was actually what made Al Jazeera what it is. That was like the 1991 Gulf War was for CNN. It was foreign policy issue that put it on the map. And then it was the horror of 9/11, and then the consequences of that, at least what the U.S. did as a consequence of that, the Afghan war, the Iraq war, which was very bloody throughout the whole period, highly emotional, devastating in its consequences and the way people perceived it. Then the 2006 war between Israel and Lebanon. Then the 2008 and 2000 war between Israel and Gaza. Those were the issues that mobilized the people, foreign policy issues, for a whole decade prior. And we don't usually notice it. And the third point I want to make on foreign policy is that one of the questions I asked throughout the whole decade is, whom among world leaders do you admire most outside your own country? Now, this is not a popularity contest. I'm not trying to see whether, Obama is popular or Putin is popular. I am asking this question like I ask in most of the questions that I design, is to try to understand the framework through which people make an evaluation. What is it that they're thinking when they select someone? What is driving them? What is the core issue that drives their selection of a person? And I'll give you just a sampling of what we found throughout the decade. After the Iraq War, that's a time when we're talking about the clash of civilization between East and West. The most popular leader in the Arab world, identified more than anyone else, Jacques Chirac of France. And why? Because he hosted Yasser Arafat when he was dying with dignity, treated him like a head of state, died in dignity in France when he was isolated in Ramallah by Israel, supported by the Bush administration, and because he was seen to have stood up to George W. Bush on the Iraq War. That was not popular. In 2006, 2007, that's the year after all the devastation in Iraq. Guess what we're talking about? It's not clash of civilization anymore. It was the Sunni-Shia divide. Now the Middle East, after the Iraq sectarianism, all driven by Sunni-Shia divide. The most popular leader in Sunni Egypt and Sunni Morocco was Hassan Nasrallah, the Shia leader of Hezbollah, in mostly Sunni countries. For a very simple reason. He was seen to have stood up to Israel in the 2006 war, stood up to the U.S., and people were rewarding him, despite the Sunni-Shia divide. 2009, who do we have? We have Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez, because he was the only world leader who cut off diplomatic relations with Israel over the Gaza war. Egypt didn't do that. Jordan didn't do that. But he was this guy from Latin America coming in and cutting off diplomatic relations with Israel over the Gaza war. People rewarded him for it. In 2010, 2011, it was the Prime Minister of Turkey, Erdogan, over the fact that he also stood up on the Gaza war, and particularly after the so-called Gaza flotilla incident, which several Turks were killed in a confrontation with the Israeli military, and then soured relations. So all of that was over foreign policy. These heroes and villains were defined on. By the way, the villains, talking about villains, when you ask people throughout the whole decade, whom among world leaders do you dislike most, George W. Bush was number one, followed by the Prime Minister of Israel, which is interesting during that, because Prime Minister of Israel historically had been usually number one, but in that particular decade, it was really Bush who trumped that. So what I'm suggesting is that while, of course, the driving forces behind the public positions are, by and large, people want freedom, people want democracy, people want rights, people want better economy, people want better life, people want jobs, people want better education. But you cannot separate their notion of dignity vis-a-vis the rulers from their notion of dignity toward the outside world. They saw the rulers in that decade as subcontractors of the enemies of their aspirations. So they were angry with the rulers, yes, over not only domestic policy but also foreign policy. You can't separate the two. They're tied together. And you see it, by the way, even now. Of course, what's driving the division in Egypt is not foreign policy. You have secularists, and you have religious people, and you have different groups vying. And Syria, the same thing, and now it's sectarianism overlaid with authoritarians against people, overlaid with foreign intervention. But guess what? Watch the debates in the Arab world. Watch the debates in Egypt. If the Muslim Brotherhood wants to delegitimize the military, they say they're subcontractors for the U.S. and Israel. And when the military wants to delegitimize the Muslim Brotherhood, they say they're subcontractors for the U.S. and Israel. And now, by the way, just if you want to get a very nice flavor of the Syria view, some conspiracy theories in Egypt who were anti-American intervention, as are most Arabs, by the way, they say that America was actually going to Syria, in order to save the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria that was now on the losing side of that. And then afterwards, it would come back to Egypt to save the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Now, of course, these are conspiracy theories that don't explain the actual dynamics, but it explains to you how central the foreign policy issues are in people's mind. That in order to legitimize someone or delegitimize them, you still have to tie them to these broader issues of aspiration, for which I have an explanation, which I will not provide just now, because I want to end with the third and final point I want to make, which is, so what is it that we're witnessing in the Arab world today, and what can we learn from it in terms of what to expect in the future? And for that, allow me to read 4 points from my concluding chapter in the book, which has 8 points and more elaborated, obviously. But I want to just read directly, and I usually don't like to read, but in this case, I think it's more efficient to read them to make the points that I want to make. First, it has to do directly with what is this phenomenon that we're witnessing? Is it really just another round of uprisings, the likes of which the Arab world has seen before, or is it something more? Well, first, the processes unleashed by the Arab revolutions are not episodic and are likely to endure. They represent an unprecedented public empowerment that transcend national boundaries, an awakening on a greater scale than ever before. Although the Arab public uprisings were not caused by the information revolution, we've long known about pervasive anger in the Arab world, the tools of information revolution constituted new mechanisms for effective organization, raised expectations, and empowered individuals, yes, individuals, in the region in unprecedented ways. Given that this information revolution continues to expand, it's not going backward, it's only going forward, public empowerment, restlessness, and assertiveness are not likely to go away. They're going to stay with us. Second, the uprisings and their consequences will play themselves out differently in each country. And the key factors in most instances will be the relative ethnic and religious homogeneity of the populace, relative wealth of the state, and the government's flexibility in providing credible steps for reform. Public empowerment does not entail public unanimity. This is one of the mistakes that people, I think, misunderstood. In fact, divisions contained in the past are likely to rise. These divisions include, but are not limited to, sectarianism. The more heterogeneous a country is, the more likely it is to experience extended conflict. Certainly this has been true in Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, where there is sectarian diversity, but is likely to be true also in countries like Egypt and Tunisia. By the way, that was written obviously before Morsi was overthrown. Likely to be in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, where there are sharp ideological divisions, particularly between secularists and liberals on the one side, and those who are more determined to see stronger intrusion of religion into politics. Each can mobilize an empowered constituency, which is a normal part of mature democratic politics, but in an environment of unstable transitions, it is also a potential recipe for confrontation and exploitation. So the empowerment is empowerment of everyone, the left and the right, the religious and the secular, the strong and the weak. So that doesn't bring people together. It could bring them into conflict in ways we hadn't experienced before. Third, while the importance of public opinion is increasing, public sentiment is never the only factor in determining political outcomes or directions of policy. So to say the public is empowered and now it has a voice that is increasingly heard or that needs to be heard doesn't mean it's going to determine politics, because publics never entirely determine politics. This is, of course, true even in mature democracies. Witnessed the relative low turnout of the American public in elections, and the increasing role of campaign contributions in shaping the outcome of American elections. And we almost had a president taking us to a limited war without public support, and he said he was willing to do so. In practice, individuals and groups don't count equally, even if they do in theory. The power of people to demonstrate and to revolt does not translate into parallel power in democratic politics. This was visible early on following the Egyptian revolution as Egypt embarked on a democratic electoral course. If the Arab uprisings were particularly remarkable in the seeming lack of need to rely on strong political institutions and organizations to mobilize large numbers of people, the electoral politics that followed showed how important organizations remain for effective politics. In fact, organizations are partly dependent on resources, and resources will continue to be unevenly divided across society. Commercial interests will find a way to organize and to have their voices heard disproportionately. The media are increasingly diverse, but given their modest ability to generate income, most media outlets remain dependent on those who have resources, including, by the way, Al Jazeera, for sure, and a political agenda of their own. The fight for narrative is in part influenced by media and resources. Witness how quickly opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, particularly those from among the elites behind the Mubarak regime, were able to turn the table and accuse the Muslim Brotherhood of being an American ally. The militaries in every Arab country will continue to matter. In Tunisia, one reason for the rapid fall of the Ben Ali regime was that the military, in essence, decided not to risk a confrontation with the public. To a lesser extent, the same could be said about Egypt in 2011, when they let Mubarak go. In Syria, the military became the instrument of the regime against the opposition, even if the price was some defections. But even in cases where the military appeared to be increasingly subordinated to elected governments, these institutions remain well organized and sometimes have vast economic interests, such as in Egypt, that they will need to protect. And rulers will continue to need their backing in unstable transitions. Again, I remind you, this was written before the overthrow of Morsi, with particular focus on this issue. I'm going to skip one of the points just to end with a conclusion. In the end, it is important to keep a sense of modesty about predicting the shape of things to come as the Arab uprising continue to unfold. There are too many moving parts within each country and across countries. The paths taken have their own impact on aspirations and motivations. There's much learning that occurs, not only by the publics, but also by rulers, businesses, organizations, and foreign powers. The distribution of resources, especially economic and military resources, will continue to be central factors in shaping events within each Arab states and across the region. And that, too, can shift as events slide this way or that. But with all the unpredictability of the Arab uprisings, one can be confident about the forces at play, particularly about the rising Arab public empowerment and its importance as a factor in local, regional, and international politics. Even as many Tunisians, Egyptians, Yemenis, Syrians, and other Arabs strive for a better life and more freedom for themselves at home, their aspirations remain connected to the aspirations of other Arabs and Muslims and to a vision of their collective place in the world. Above all, they want to hold their heads high. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Telhami. That provides a thoughtful background for questions from our audience. I'd like to especially welcome the students from Mills High School here this evening. Let's pick up a thread from your comments about Al Jazeera. We have had Al Jazeera in the Middle East since 1996, and we would appreciate your very quick comments about whether it has maintained its dominant role in the Middle East, and also why the Qatari owners of Al Jazeera have invested in raising the profile of Al Jazeera America, and whether you believe it will be accepted as a news service by Americans.
It's a very good question. And as I said, I've studied Al Jazeera very carefully. I've watched it from the outset. I have a whole chapter in the book about Al Jazeera specifically. And I appear on Al Jazeera. I appear on Al Jazeera Arabic, and I appear on Al Jazeera English, and I appear on Al Jazeera America. So I have a very good feel for them. I also interviewed the emir who started it, the former emir of Qatar, and I talked to the leadership about their vision for Al Jazeera. So I have a good sense. Let me just make 3 broad points. The first point is that starting with Al Jazeera Arabic, which is really the one that put them on the map, that is the one that made all the difference. When you look at what has happened, particularly since 1995 when they were started, you have to be amazed at how they transformed the media environment. And to my own mind, the reason for their success is twofold. One, resources. Obviously, they backed it with a lot of money, and so you don't have to make profit. So it gives you a lot of advantages. But second, they were the first station in the new market of media in the Middle East with the advent of satellite to understand that you no longer have captive audiences, that people have choices, and that if you really want to have viewership, you have to understand your consumer. And in order to understand, in order to get the viewership, you have to cater to that consumer. And so with the advent of Al Jazeera, Al Jazeera couldn't think I'm a Qatari station. They have to think I'm a station that aims to get everyone who speaks Arabic to watch me. That's 350 million people, as opposed to 300,000 Qatari citizens. I mean, that is quite a big difference. And in order to appeal to that consumer, you had to appeal to your prototype consumer becomes the Arab and the Muslim. So the reason for their success is not so much that they had something to sell, but that they catered to what the public wants. They put a product, they wanted diversity, want more. And we saw them even up until the Arab uprisings. We saw them really dominate the market. Almost half of the people that we polled say that Al Jazeera is their first choice for news, and another 20-some% said the second choice for news, while Arabs have hundreds of choices now available to them. So that's number one. Number two, we tested the notion that the Al Jazeera line helps shape opinion, particularly the anti-Americanism. Remember, we particularly after the Iraq War, people were, Al Jazeera was accused of essentially, telling Arabs to hate America. I mean, we had this was a convenient explanation by our politicians. Oh, it's Al Jazeera that makes them dislike America. In our statistical analysis of differentiating people who watch Al Jazeera, people who didn't, people who had satellite television, people who didn't, we saw hardly any differences, and in some cases we actually saw that people who watched Al Jazeera had slightly better views of the U.S. in some cases. We also had every evidence to show that people who watch Al Jazeera watch it because it caters to their opinion, and they dump them when they don't. We saw that in Lebanon specifically with the Shia community. In 2006, when they were confronting Israel, Al Jazeera championed their cause. When we asked people what station was their first choice for news, it wasn't the Shia al-Manar television, but it was Al Jazeera. After the Syrian crisis, when Syria took the position against the Hezbollah and the Syrian regime, most Shia don't watch it. in our polling. So it's a self-selection, just like people who watch Fox News are people who already are in that space much more. People who watch MSNBC are already in that space before. So we have to understand that there's limits to their influence. But the third point I want to make is about, so why are the Qataris doing it? I mean, they're spending a lot of money, in some, I think, billions now with all these. Why are they doing it? Well, initially, they did it for two principal reasons. The first is that when they started Jazeera, this new emir who overthrew his dad in just the year before, were under criticism from mostly Saudi-dominated media. Qatar was the butt of jokes and criticism by Egyptian media and Saudi media. And he thought by having a station that took away the market share, at least they're not criticizing him. And I think he was right. And second, by putting a station that is popular and presented a pan-Arab and Islamic identity, that he can actually balance the fact that he was deep down a very pro-American emir with an American air base on his soil from which American airplanes were attacking Iraq during the Iraq War, that same Iraq War that Al Jazeera was putting the editorial line of opposing. And so it helped buffer him from criticism by putting out this station. Does that extend to America? It's very hard to know, what his aim specifically was when he started. He's no longer emir. He abdicated a few months ago for his son, and we don't know where his son is going to take this. But I think Al Jazeera became an instrument of influence for the Qataris. The Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia was quoted jokingly of referring to Qatar. I think he was misunderstood personally, but he was saying it's a 300 people on a television station. And what he meant, of course, is 300,000, I think. He didn't need to dismiss them to that extent. But the point is that television station has become a source of influence. And they certainly can have it in America. But here's what I would say about their Al Jazeera America. Number one is they can succeed in large part because they have resources and they don't need to make money at a time when news organizations are really on the defensive in America, so they can fill a gap. Number two, they know that Americans are not going to watch them if they're going to be seen to be propagandistic. So they have to put a product like it in the Arab world that appeals to America. In fact, the first month of review, journalistic review of their coverage of even the Syria crisis, that is the heart of the Middle East, was they looked very much like CNN without Wolf Blitzer. And with that.
I believe we're coming up toward our last question. Is that correct, Josh? All right. There's a, and I'm sorry I can't take more of your questions, but there's a huge undercurrent in the audience of questioning the relationship between Islam and democracy. So let's just try to do this as much as we can. Unlike Christianity, Islam is a state and a religion which were one. Therefore, is Western democracy unsuitable for Islamic countries? And how have, to then drill down a bit about that, how have opinions about the role of religion in government changed over the course of the Arab Spring?
First of all, on Islam and democracy, I think that I have no doubt that some religious fanatics want to impose what they think is the Word of God over anything else. I have no doubt about that. I mean, you have a large number of people who want to impose their religious views as the law of the land over anything else. And that obviously is something that liberals have feared. But to say that's Islam or not a particular interpretation by what is really a minority of people within the Arab world is a mistake. I think in most people are along the lines that I suggested when you refer to Sharia, it's very hard to say you're a Muslim and not believe in Sharia. I mean, it's parcel of what you do. It's, by the way, in Arabic, even the term legitimacy, shari, comes from the term Sharia. So you embrace it. The question is, how do you apply it and what are the implications? So every constitution has been, quote, based on Sharia, but that has been separate. If you look at the Egyptian public reaction to the Brotherhood, as I said, I think the biggest motive wasn't the fact they didn't perform economically. I think the biggest factor was the fact that they were seen to want to dictate to the public the rules of the game on religious grounds, and even religious people didn't accept that. They don't want that. And I think when people say Christianity isn't like that, we forget about Christianity. I mean, the history of the time when people used to say the same thing about the Word of God and what it entails. Where you have religious fanatics who are Christians who think what they think is the Word of God is the one that should be imposed on the law of the land, and we have Jewish fanatics who think the same way. We have Muslim fanatics who think the same way. These things evolve over time, obviously, and change. So I don't really see it as a specific problem to Islamic societies. I see it as a specific problem to some fanatical religious organization who want to impose the will on the rest of the people.
Do you want to comment on the effect of the role of religion during the Arab Spring?
Yes. I think, when you look particularly at Tunisia and Egypt, you have to say that one of the things that work for the religious, the political Islamic group particularly, is that they were the best organized. And so, for example, in Egypt, Mubarak didn't really allow any legitimate opposition to grow. In part, he wanted to set up, you take me or you take the Muslim Brotherhood. The Tunisians suppressed the state, didn't have much opposition, but much of the opposition organized in the outside. It was a really different model from Egypt. But when you look particularly at the Egyptian elections, and you have to say that the result of the elections, both in the parliamentary elections, but later in the presidential rounds of elections, were in large part a function of organizations, much more than political parties meeting the aspirations of the public. So, for example, in the end, when you had the first round of presidential elections, it was striking that despite all of the people who initiated the revolution in Egypt, that were more secular, more liberal, more young, they were so disorganized and split that the two winning parties, the individuals, were the ones who were put by the only two very well organized groups, the Muslim Brotherhood on the one hand, and remnants of the Mubarak regime, people who came out of the Mubarak era, represented by Shafi, the presidential candidate who then ran against Mursi, which was one of the problems for the majority of the people. That's why we had low turnout in the elections, because it was very painful for people to see this is not what they had thought. So yes, religion has performed well, in part because it's people who were behind it were mobilized like everybody else, but in part because they had already been much better organized, and they have been very effective in the political arena since the Arab uprisings.
Those comments will conclude our program this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, please join me in thanking Shibley Telhami for his insightful comments tonight.